Welcome to a special edition of I Said What I Said. I'm Brad Wakai alongside my co-host Tyson Gentry. And Tyson, it's a special edition today, man, because we don't normally talk UFC on this podcast, but we had to make an episode strictly about Sean O'Malley, who comes off his knockout victory over Aljamain Sterling at UFC 292 over the weekend. And there are a lot of things going on now with the UFC, a lot of rhetoric that's been talked about, and you're the UFC guy on this podcast. So mainly I wanted to have this because I wanted some answers from the own questions that I have in regards to Sean O'Malley and the things that are next for him and the UFC in general. So let's just start here. What were your thoughts on the fight overall and what you saw out of Sean O'Malley?
Same. I mean, it wasn't exactly what I was expecting. I thought that Aljamain Sterling was probably going to end up lassoing him in when Sean tries to throw a high kick, backpacking him, sink the hooks in, and choke somebody, because that's what Aljo does. But like, Sean's distance management is getting better every single time he steps inside the octagon. And then we'll get into it too, but he gets a lot of flack from people, I think, that maybe aren't watching, because he just knocked out Aljamain Sterling in a fantastic counter punch. Like, Aljo overextended, lunged in, and just threw the right, and it was over. He beat Peter Yan too. And so, like, he can't grapple all this stuff, but like, the best wrestler in the division outside of Merab, Dvalishvili, didn't really even try to engage in that aspect. Sean his reach is much longer than pretty much everybody else in the division, besides like Corey Sandhagen's got to be pretty close, but Sean's also huge. And so when you talk about, his reach and he's going to be able to control the distance, additionally being 5 extra inches taller makes it a hell of a lot harder to get inside and kind of get those things done. So we talk about this guy like, he's got no grappling, but we haven't really had to see it.
Yeah, and that's what I noticed when I was watching too in that first round. And I thought Daniel Cormier pointed out, Sean looks nervous coming in, and then he settled in, I thought, early in that fight. And even Cormier said, I was maybe wrong. Like, he just maybe was nervous on the walkout, which O'Malley admitted after the fight. Like, he was super nervous. How could you not be? But I thought there were a couple times that Aljo tried to take him down. And I thought Sean's defense on that, granted, he was up against the cage, so it helped him. But that's also part of the sport, right? You have to know where are you vulnerable, how do you defend against it. I actually thought, just in this limited sample size against Aljo, I thought he did a good job defending from the takedown. And then, like you said, his distance control was great. He was on the outside. I know people probably wanted fireworks early, but you're just not going to get that in the championship fight. And then he closed the show in the second round.
And I mean, let's talk about this part a little bit. I think part of the reason, or where a lot of that stems from, is half these highlights that you see is when he's a beanpole and he hasn't filled out. He's much thicker now than he was, and part of that, right? He gets suspended for the marijuana. He hurts himself against Chito Vera and is out for 7 months or 8 months after that. So since let's go July of 2021, so the last 2 years, we've seen him fight Chris Matino. We've seen him 1, 2, 3, 4 other times, including on Saturday. So that makes it really hard to kind of separate the two things because you're like, all your highlights you get of this guy is 100 and he looks tiny. And then he comes out there and he's so much bigger, I think, than people expect. And it's basically impossible to replicate in training, because I don't know who you're finding that's built like that, that's that quick at that weight.
Yeah, and that's what Aljo said. He tried to get guys who would replicate that distance and that length, and he just couldn't do it because, again, this guy, because of his very slight nature, right? Like, he fits this weight class because he's not built up. Like, he's not ripped like Aljo. Like, Aljo has to cut weight, and it's just a really tall kid who's super lanky, and he's just like a unicorn in that division. Just, he also can knock you out. And I think that I want to move into this because everybody's questioning or kind of saying this guy is the next superstar, next face of the UFC. And I want to get your opinion on this. Maybe it's a little too soon. We saw Rogan and Cormier compare him to Conor McGregor after the fight, like putting the side-by-side on Jose Aldo when McGregor knocked him out. I want to say this. I want to get your opinion on this. I think, to me, why he can become an absolute superstar in the face of the sport is because he can knock you out in one punch. Like, he's not Khabib, where he dominates you and it looks like he's just beating somebody's ass, but it's like kind of boring because it's just repetitive and the other guy's like not really getting knocked out. He can knock you out in one punch, and that's going to sell tickets. That's going to sell cards. That's going to make you a fan favorite. That Tyson, even if he loses a couple of his next fights, people are still going to love this guy because he can knock you out at any point. And I think that's the thing that people are kind of missing about the Sean O'Malley, the Sugar Show.
And another part, I agree, that just highlight reels make things better, makes it easier to promote, obviously. But like a lot of talk right now is Dana and the UFC want Sean O'Malley to be the next face of the UFC. If you noticed, as soon as this main event wrapped up, they posted the entire finish on YouTube. They haven't done that since Conor McGregor. So yeah, there are those things where they're pushing him a little bit forward. My thing, and this is kind of just the way people talk about this guy, Sean O'Malley is making Sean O'Malley the face of the UFC because Dana White didn't show up and beat Peter Yan, and Dana White didn't knock out Aljamain Sterling. So you run through his resume, right, and you're not that impressed. A lot of those names on there, like you might recognize, but there are 7 guys in his last 11 or whatever fights that are no longer in the UFC. So if you're new to it or you just haven't really been paying attention, he hasn't fought a ton of people, but like Eddie Wineland was a killer. Got him out of there, walked off on him in the middle of COVID. He has the fight with Cheeto that obviously takes the nerve damage, but he beats Thomas Almeida. He really beat Pedro Munoz in 2 rounds, and it got ruled a no contest. It's tough to get mad at the guy for willingly kind of padding the resume, so to speak, when in reality, he knows what it sells. You have to be undefeated, right? Like the Sugar Show was 12-0, 13-0, takes a loss. And then he kind of wants to get back in people's minds because he's disappeared a couple times from the sport. So I'm not saying that the UFC is the one pushing this kid forward. I just think he's not as good at press conferences as people want him to be. I think there's a sense when you see the rainbow hair and kind of just his personality that you think, oh man, this is just like Conor. He's way different, but you catch this guy on a podcast and he's real and he's true to himself, which I think always sells. That's kind of the nature of the fight game. Dude, he's beat the 2 best guys in the division. He's beaten the last 2 champions in this division. He will ragdoll TJ Dillashaw. He'll beat up any of those other guys. I think Merab gives him real problems, and we'll talk about who's next, but he's the champion now. And so if you think that he's going to have to pick and choose, or the UFC is going to say, oh, no, you're going to fight the number 1 contender. This is an instance. This isn't Kamaru Usman when he first got the belt or Aljo when he first got the belt. So the UFC is going to be a little nicer in allowing him to maybe keep this thing or taking matchups that are a little better for him, which is good for the business.
Exactly. And we'll talk about what's next, like you said. I just want to get another thought on this, too, because everybody's saying, and Aljamain Sterling said that in the lead up to the fight, like this is a spoiled kid that's been propped up by Dana White in the UFC. Well, it turns out that there's a reason, right? Because like Sean O'Malley said, he knows what that right hand can do, and it put Aljamain Sterling out. Like, and he didn't knock him out 1 punch. Like he had to finish it off, but that's the fight, right? Like that's the sport. He TKO'd him, but he put him down with 1 punch, a perfect slip, and boom, used that dynamite in the right hand to make a statement. So I want to get your thoughts for a go forward here. Is that enough? Like, is this division, like, because when John Jones was winning light heavy and he was doing crazy stuff, it was great. Back in the day, Anderson Silva, he had the crazy highlight stuff. Can a guy at this weight class truly be the face of the UFC going forward, like Dana White and Sean O'Malley is positioning to be?
I think so. I think 135 is really the cutoff because it's really hard to get kind of more casual fans super interested in like, oh, there's another Brandon Moreno fight tonight. But then like when they're 125 pounds, like Demetrius Johnson might be the best fighter in the history of the entire promotion, and they've basically whitewashed him from history. But we saw with Henry Cejudo, people know his name. He comes from 125, jumps to 135, wins the belt. Dominic Cruz for a long time. TJ Dillashaw, obviously, even when Renan Barão was writing off 20 wins in a row. Heavyweight is in a state of flux right now where it just kind of feels, and I think the overwhelming thought on heavyweight is like, well, it's just John Jones and a bunch of guys. And that's going to be the case unless Stipe Miocic is able to knock him out at 45 without really giving a shit about being a fighter anymore. At light heavyweight, you're hopeful that Alex Pereira can take that over. He's a non-English speaker, right? You run down to 185. Israel Adesanya is the most probably divisive figure in the entire organization for fans. 170, Leon Edwards doesn't really get anybody excited, even though he's a beast. At 155, the most popular fighters are Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, like a bunch of guys without the belt, right? So Islam is awesome. Again, it's one of those things where it almost feels like, yeah, but you're Khabib too. So no matter what he does, I don't think he's going to take over the whole thing. And then Volkanovski almost arrived at a point of we just consider him unbeatable immediately, right? And so when he fights Islam, the story is, but he almost won though. It's not look at how good Islam is at 155. And so I think Sean has a real shot, and that's every champion above him. And another really important thing to consider is like this division for a long time, Aljo kind of put on more boring fights, quote unquote, because he was a lot better than everybody. And so it just sounded like it looked maybe not as interesting when he's choking somebody out or he's monkeying TJ Dillashaw from the back, because it doesn't, it just felt, uncompetitive, and it's different. It's harder for people to get into that style. I think absolutely he can be the face of the UFC because dude, it's just knockout highlight. Like you can fit his reel or his highlights on reels on Instagram, on YouTube videos. You can put them on TikTok, and you're going to be able to draw more fans. And on top of that, he streams video games. He's got 1 million of those subscribers on there. He smokes a bunch of weed. He posts funny Instagram content. People. He's involved in pop culture in a way that none of the other champions really are.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too, especially when you try to connect with these guys, right? Like if you're trying to make a face of the sport, you're trying to get them going forward. Like you really need that, I think. And so, I mean, that's good to hear. Like I'm a fringe guy. Tyson's the expert. He watches like all these fights. I jump in for the big ones, and this was a big one to me, man, because this kid like truly had the chance to take the superstar status. And I thought he did that. And so naturally, Tyson, what's next? Like that's what everybody's asking. When are we going to see him back in the ring? Me personally, I think he's going to fight Chito Vera. I think he's going to get the rematch. I think that's what Dana wants. I think with the belt on the line, we saw it before. I think they're going to be able to sell that. I mean, Chito's popular to a lot of people. I think that would that'd be a great promotion for the UFC. I think it would get a lot of eyeballs on this. And with a chance that Sean can retain the belt again, and now we really make that division interesting. But what do you think is going to happen? You know the sport better than anybody.
I think that this is a perfect instance of UFC politics are about to take place, because when Sean O'Malley got hurt and lost the fight against Chito Vera with the nerve damage, Chito wouldn't give him an immediate rematch. And now that Sean O'Malley is the champ, Chito is on Twitter and he's saying, sign the dotted line, I'm ready, blah, blah, blah. Well, you didn't give him the shot a while ago. And I know that sounds petty. This is the way this thing works. Corey Sandhagen would be another one that's up. He just basically beat the shit out of Rob. I wanted to say Rob Font, but that's not right. Anyways, crushed somebody, hurt his elbow. He's out for probably 6 months with that. And then Merab Dvalishvili he's a monster. He's Aljamain's training partner. He is the reason if Aljo won this fight, he was going to jump up to 145. But Dana White is not going to put Merab in this position because Merab is boring. And I like Merab, but it's 55 takedown attempts, and I don't think they're going to want to sell that. Sean is going to get on Twitter and say he wants to fight Gervonta Davis. I think the Chito fight is the most likely, but I'm not ruling out a Henry Cejudo fight. And I know that sounds silly because he just lost. They have a history of beefing with each other on the internet. This is fresh meat. I don't think that Aljamain Sterling is going to get an immediate rematch. I don't even know how badly he really wants one at this point, but I really think it's going to be Henry. I would rather have it be Merab for the integrity side of things, but I really don't think it's going to be Chito unless Sean decides, look, I'm going to kill this guy, because Chito fought on the same card and he fought Pedro Munoz, and it wasn't it wasn't what Sean did to him. And maybe he's looking at that going, okay, like I want to prove to everybody I'm much better than this guy. It's harder to knock out Chito than it's probably going to be anybody else in the division. That's just the way that dude's built. So I think the Henry fight's next.
Wow. How about that? A great prediction. I can't wait. This guy's must watch. That's just the fact of it, man. It's the fight game. You got to sell fights. This kid's box office, man. And I know people don't like him, but man, I always said this immediately after the fight, the kid walks the shit or talks the shit, but he also walks the shit. And that's what you want out of your fighter. And Tyson, while we close this out, we love Sean O'Malley. One of the things too is because he's from Montana, and we're both Montanans. We had to mention this here, and I know a bunch of people. I've been seeing this. Like people are sharing this stuff on Facebook. Like we have listeners in Montana. Obviously, we're both from there. If you don't like him because he doesn't like represent Montana to the way that you think he should, like I just don't understand that. Just flat out, he's from Helena. Okay, he went and fought in Arizona so he could become champion. Really, you're going to hate on the kid for that? Like, I just don't understand at all. He wanted to be a superstar. He went to Arizona to accomplish this. Like, I don't understand why anybody's knocking him for that. So that's just my 2 cents. Now, of course, I'm one of the people that moved away. I now live in New York. So it is different for people who stay in Montana their whole lives and want to represent it their way. So I can kind of see both sides. But come on, man, you don't like him because he doesn't do it your way? Come on, this kid is awesome. I just don't get it.
He doesn't claim us, so there's a lot of people that get really upset about that. But I'm old enough to remember when certain guys would come through and just train at the dog pound a couple times, like Josh Barnett, and then the whole state was like, "Oh no, that guy's one of us. He's been here before." No, look, man, I don't give a shit. Like, there's a reason that he's the first of any note to do really anything of this caliber from this place, and it's because it's really hard to do it when you live here. Right, like look at how Bryce Mitchell's doing, trying to make a championship run in the UFC without leaving Arkansas. Got about to the top 10 and got smoked. Right, yep. And like that's just going to continue to be the buzzsaw. Sometimes you got to leave to grow, and that's all right with me.
All right. Well, I to put a bow on this, I just can't wait for another one of his fights. Tyson's representing Montana for those who listening on podcast form, but I mean, fantastic by Sean O'Malley. Next face of the UFC ? Like we got to know. He's got to have
exclamation mark.
Else. Exclamation point. Let's go. That's going to do it all for us. Like, subscribe, and share the show. We appreciate you as always. Let us know on our social media channels whether you agree, disagree, who you want to see Sean fight next. If you're tuning in, whether if you like him or not, let us know. We'll be back with more content later in the week. So stay tuned for that. Peace.